The wisdom behind the drawl. The marble floors of the Rayburn House office building echoed with the sharp clicks of designer heels as Senator Margaret Whitfield strode purposefully toward the conference room. Her tailored navy suit spoke of power, her Harvard law degree gleaming like armor in the form of perfectly polished credentials displayed in her office down the hall. Today's bipartisan committee meeting on rural infrastructure would be another opportunity to showcase her intellectual superiority over what she privately called the country club of good old boys. As she entered the oak-paneled room, Margaret's eyes immediately fell upon Senator Tommy Tuberville, who sat at the far end of the mahogany table, his Alabama drawl already filling the space as he chatted with a few colleagues about Auburn's football prospects. His relaxed posture and easy smile irritated her instantly. Here was a man who had stumbled into politics from the football field, she thought, completely out of his depth in the complex world of governance. "Good morning, Senator Tuberville," Margaret said, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes as she took her seat directly across from him. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished table, where thick briefing books and legal pads awaited their owners. "Mornin', Senator Whitfield," Tommy replied warmly, his Alabama accent thick as honey. "Beautiful day in the Capitol, ain't it?" Margaret's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The man's casual demeanor in such a formal setting reinforced everything she believed about his unsuitability for the Senate. Around them, other senators filtered in, seasoned politicians from both sides of the aisle, each carrying themselves with the weight of their office. Senator James Rodriguez from California nodded respectfully to both colleagues, while Senator Patricia Chen from Oregon reviewed her notes with characteristic intensity. The committee chairman, Senator Robert Hayes from Missouri, called the meeting to order. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're here today to discuss the Rural Infrastructure Enhancement Act. This legislation will affect millions of Americans in small towns and farming communities across our great nation." As Hayes outlined the agenda, Margaret's attention drifted to Tommy, who seemed more interested in the pastoral painting on the wall than the complex economic data being presented. She rolled her eyes slightly, catching the amused glance of her chief of staff, David, who sat in the gallery behind her. "Senator Tuberville," Chairman Hayes said, "would you like to share Alabama's perspective on this infrastructure package?" Tommy straightened in his chair, his hands folded calmly on the table. "Well, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the opportunity. You know, folks back home in Alabama have been dealing with crumbling bridges and potholes bigger than football stadiums for years now. This here legislation could make a real difference in their daily lives." Margaret couldn't help herself. She leaned forward, her voice dripping with condescension. "Senator, while I'm sure your folksy observations about potholes are charming to your constituents, perhaps we should focus on the actual economic implications of this $47 billion expenditure. The multiplier effects, the cost-benefit analysis, the long-term fiscal sustainability. These are complex matters that require serious consideration." The room fell silent. Several senators shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, while staff members in the gallery exchanged worried glances. Margaret's tone had crossed the line from professional disagreement to personal attack, and everyone in the room felt it. Tommy's expression remained calm, but something flickered in his eyes, not anger but disappointment. He'd encountered this type of intellectual elitism before, both in his coaching days and now in politics. People who mistook accent for intelligence, simplicity for stupidity. "Senator Whitfield," Tommy said quietly, his voice steady despite the insult, "I understand your concerns about the economics of this bill. They're valid concerns, and I respect your expertise in that area. But you know, sometimes the most complex problems have surprisingly simple solutions if you take the time to really listen to the people affected." Margaret's lips curled into a slight sneer. "Oh, please, Senator. We're not dealing with game plans and locker room pep talks here. This is the United States Senate, not some high school gymnasium. Maybe if you spent less time with your good old boys back home and more time studying actual policy, you'd understand the nuances involved. She paused, her voice rising slightly with confidence. I mean, really, what could a former football coach possibly understand about macroeconomic policy? You're just a... She hesitated for a moment, but her arrogance pushed her forward. A dumb countryman playing politics. The silence that followed was deafening. Senator Rodriguez's pen stopped moving across his notepad. Senator Chen looked up sharply from her documents. Chairman Hayes' face flushed red with embarrassment for the institution they all served. In the gallery, staff members stared in shock at Margaret's breach of Senate decorum. Tommy remained perfectly still for a long moment, his weathered hands still folded on the table. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, but carried clearly through the hushed chamber. You know, Senator Whitfield, he began, his Alabama drawl somehow more pronounced now, you might be surprised to learn that this dumb countryman has given a lot of thought to the issues facing rural America. But before we get into policy details, let me share something with you that I learned a long time ago. He paused, looking around the room at his colleagues, then back to Margaret, who sat with her arms crossed, clearly expecting some homespun platitude that would prove her point about his intellectual limitations. There's an old saying that I've carried with me through my coaching career and now into this job, Tommy continued, his voice gaining strength. It goes like this. It is better to remain silent and be thought a fool than to speak and remove all doubt. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Margaret's confident expression began to falter as she realized the quote's implication and its author. That wisdom, Tommy continued, his eyes never leaving Margaret's face, came from a pretty smart fella. Maybe you've heard of him, Abraham Lincoln. The silence in the conference room stretched like a taut wire, ready to snap. Margaret Whitfield felt the blood drain from her face as the full impact of Tommy Tuberville's words settled over the room like morning fog over the Potomac. Around the mahogany table, senators who had witnessed countless political battles sat frozen, understanding that they had just observed something far more devastating than any policy debate. They had seen a master class in dignity responding to arrogance. Chairman Hayes cleared his throat, his discomfort palpable. Perhaps we should take a brief recess, he suggested, his voice barely above a whisper, but Tommy raised his hand gently. If I may, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to continue. Senator Whitfield raised some important questions about fiscal responsibility, and I think the people of Alabama and all our states deserve a thoughtful response. Margaret's carefully constructed composure crumbled. She had built her entire political identity around being the smartest person in the room, the Harvard-educated policy wonk who could outthink and outdebate anyone. Now, faced with the quiet wisdom of a man she had just publicly humiliated herself by underestimating, she felt smaller than she had ever felt in her life. Senator, she began, her voice shaky, I apologize. That was completely inappropriate and unprofessional. Tommy nodded graciously. I appreciate that, Senator. We all say things in the heat of the moment. What matters is how we move forward. He stood slowly, walking to the window that overlooked the Capitol grounds, where tourists gathered in small groups, their children pointing excitedly at the dome that symbolized American democracy. The autumn sun cast golden light across his weathered face, highlighting the lines that spoke of decades spent under Friday night lights and on sidelines, teaching young people not just about football, but about character. You know, Tommy continued, still gazing out the window, when I was coaching at Auburn, I had a player once. Bright kid, full scholarship, pre-med student. He thought he was too smart for the basic drills, too sophisticated for the simple plays. He'd roll his eyes when I'd talk about fundamentals, about blocking and tackling and showing up every day ready to work. Senator Rodriguez leaned forward, sensing that this story held deeper meaning. Around the table, the other senators found themselves drawn into Tommy's narrative despite themselves. This young man would give interviews to the sports reporters, using big words and complex football terminology to show how much smarter he was than his teammates. He'd critique the coaching staff, suggest that maybe college football needed more intellectual approaches to the game. Tommy turned back to face the committee, his eyes settling briefly on Margaret before continuing. Well, the season started, and we played our first game against a team from Louisiana. Their players weren't as highly recruited, didn't have the same academic credentials, but they had something else. They understood that football at its heart is about execution, teamwork, and respect for your opponents. The room was completely silent now. Even the staff members in the gallery had stopped rustling papers and checking phones, captivated by the story unfolding before them. Our smart young player got schooled that day, Tommy continued, settling back into his chair. Not because he wasn't intelligent, he was plenty smart, but because he had confused knowledge with wisdom, academic credentials with understanding. He spent so much time trying to prove how clever he was that he forgot the fundamentals of what we were trying to accomplish as a team. Margaret's throat felt tight. She recognized herself in that story with painful clarity. After the game, Tommy said, this young man came to my office. He was humbled, embarrassed, but also curious. He asked me why the simple game plan had worked for the other team when our complex strategies had failed. So I told him what my high school coach had told me years earlier. Tommy's voice grew softer, more contemplative. Football, like life, like governing, isn't really about showing how smart you are. It's about understanding people, understanding problems, and finding solutions that work. Sometimes the most profound insights come from the simplest observations. Sometimes the person you're quickest to dismiss might be the one with the most valuable perspective. Senator Chen, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, found herself nodding involuntarily. She thought about her own journey from a small immigrant family in Portland to the halls of Congress, remembering the times when people had underestimated her because of her accent, her appearance, her background. That player, Tommy continued, went on to become one of our team captains. Not because he got any smarter, he was always intelligent, but because he learned to combine his intelligence with humility, his knowledge with wisdom. He learned that true leadership isn't about proving you're the smartest person in the room. It's about bringing out the best in everyone around you. Margaret's eyes were glistening now, though she fought to maintain her composure. The weight of her words, "dumb countryman," echoed in her mind like a gavel striking a guilty verdict. She had spent her entire career building walls around herself with credentials and condescension, never realizing how those walls had isolated her not just from colleagues like Tommy, but from the very people she had sworn to serve. "Senator Tuberville," she said, her voice barely audible, "I owe you more than an apology. I owe you an explanation, though I'm not sure I have a good one." The room remained silent, but the silence had changed. It was no longer the shocked quiet that had followed her insult, but the respectful hush that comes when people recognize they are witnessing something rare and meaningful. Genuine human connection breaking through political pretense. "No explanation needed, Senator," Tommy replied gently. "We all bring our own experiences and perspectives to this job. The challenge is learning to value the differences instead of being threatened by them." Chairman Hayes, who had been in politics for over 20 years, realized he was watching something unprecedented. In an era where political discourse had devolved into sound bites and social media attacks, here was an old-fashioned moment of grace and dignity that reminded him why he had entered public service in the first place. The autumn afternoon sun filtered through the tall windows of Margaret Whitfield's Senate office, casting long shadows across the law books that lined her mahogany shelves. 2 weeks had passed since the committee meeting, but the memory of that moment played in her mind like a song she couldn't shake. She sat behind her imposing desk, staring at a framed photograph of herself, shaking hands with the president at her swearing-in ceremony. But for the first time, the image brought her no satisfaction. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called, expecting her Chief of Staff David with the afternoon briefing materials. Instead, Senator Tommy Tuberville stepped into her office, his presence somehow making the formal space feel warmer. He carried a simple manila folder and wore the same easy smile that had once irritated her, but now seemed like a beacon of authentic humanity in the artificial world of Washington politics. "Senator Tuberville," Margaret said, rising from her chair, genuinely surprised by his visit. "Please have a seat. Would you like some coffee?" "That's mighty kind of you," Tommy replied, settling into one of the leather chairs across from her desk. "And please call me Tommy." "I think we've moved past the formal stage, don't you think?" Margaret felt a flush of shame at the reference to their previous encounter, but Tommy's tone held no malice, only gentle humor. She poured 2 cups of coffee from the elegant service set that had been a gift from her law school classmates, her hands trembling slightly as she remembered how those same hands had been folded arrogantly across her chest just 2 weeks earlier. "Tommy," she began, setting his cup before him, "I've been meaning to come see you. What I said in that committee meeting. There's no excuse for it. I've been in politics long enough to know better, and I've been alive long enough to know better." Tommy took a sip of his coffee, his weathered face thoughtful. "You know, Margaret. May I call you Margaret? I've been thinking about our conversation too. Not dwelling on it, mind you, but reflecting on it. And I realized something important." He set down his cup and opened the manila folder he had brought with him. Inside were several sheets of paper covered with handwritten notes and printed articles. Margaret could see her name mentioned in several of the documents. "I did some homework on you," Tommy said, his tone conversational rather than confrontational. "Turns out this dumb countryman learned some pretty impressive things about the senator from Connecticut." Margaret's eyebrows rose in surprise. She had expected many things from this visit, but not research into her background. "Did you know," Tommy continued, pulling out one of the articles, "that you were the first in your family to graduate college, that you worked 3 jobs to pay for law school at Harvard, that you spent 5 years as a public defender taking on cases that other lawyers wouldn't touch because the clients couldn't pay?" Margaret's throat tightened. Those were parts of her story she rarely discussed anymore. Chapters from her life that seemed incongruous with the polished political persona she had cultivated. "I found an interview you gave to the Hartford Courant 10 years ago," Tommy said, holding up another clipping. "You talked about growing up in a working-class neighborhood, about how your father worked double shifts at the manufacturing plant to support the family. You said, and I quote, 'I never want to forget where I came from, or the people who sacrificed to get me here.'" The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. She remembered that interview, remembered being so passionate about staying connected to her roots, about never losing sight of the struggles that had shaped her. When had that passion transformed into the intellectual arrogance that had led her to dismiss Tommy so cruelly? "Tommy, she started, but he held up his hand gently. "I'm not sharing this to embarrass you," he said kindly. "I'm sharing it because I think somewhere along the way, you started protecting yourself from being dismissed the way you dismissed me. You built up walls of credentials and expertise because you were afraid people would see you as just another working-class kid who didn't belong in these marble halls." Margaret felt tears threatening to spill over. The accuracy of his assessment was devastating in its gentleness. She had spent so many years proving she belonged, proving she was smart enough, sophisticated enough, worthy enough that she had forgotten the values that had brought her to public service in the first place. "You're right," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I became everything I used to despise. I became the kind of person who would have looked down on my own father." Tommy leaned forward in his chair, his expression filled with compassion rather than judgment. "The beautiful thing about that realization, Margaret, is that it's never too late to remember who you really are. Your father raised a daughter who cared about justice, about fighting for people who couldn't fight for themselves. That person is still in there." He pulled out another document from his folder. This one looked like a legislative proposal, covered with handwritten notes in Tommy's careful script. "I've been working on something," he said, "and I could use your help. It's about the rural infrastructure bill we were discussing in committee, but I want to approach it differently than we usually do in Washington." Margaret wiped her eyes discreetly and tried to focus on the papers he was showing her. The proposal was surprisingly comprehensive, addressing not just physical infrastructure, but also digital connectivity, healthcare access, and educational opportunities for rural communities. This is actually quite sophisticated," Margaret said, then immediately caught herself. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to sound surprised, Tommy chuckled good-naturedly. "It's all right. I know how it sounds coming from a football coach. But you see, coaching taught me something valuable about problem solving. When you're facing a complex opponent, you don't just look at their strengths. You study everything. Their weaknesses, their patterns, their history. You talk to everyone who's played against them, everyone who knows them." He pointed to various sections of his proposal. "So when I started thinking about rural infrastructure, I didn't just read government reports. I talked to farmers in Alabama, factory workers in Ohio, teachers in rural Montana, small business owners in Iowa. I listened to their stories, understood their daily challenges." Margaret found herself leaning forward, genuinely interested in his approach. That's actually brilliant. Most policy proposals start with data and statistics, but you started with human experiences. "Exactly," Tommy said, his eyes lighting up. "And that's where you come in. You have the legal expertise, the policy background, the understanding of how to navigate the legislative process. I have the grassroots perspective and the relationships with rural communities. Together, we might actually be able to create something that works for real people, instead of just looking good in committee hearings." For the first time in weeks, Margaret felt a spark of the passion that had originally drawn her to politics. The possibility of combining Tommy's authentic connection to constituents with her policy expertise seemed not just promising, but necessary. "You know what the most impressive thing about your proposal is?" Margaret said, flipping through the pages. "It's not trying to prove how smart you are, it's trying to solve actual problems." Tommy smiled. "Sometimes the smartest thing you can do is keep it simple. My old coach used to say, complicated plays impress reporters, but simple plays win games." Margaret laughed, the first genuine laugh she'd had in months. "I think I'm beginning to understand the difference between being intelligent and being wise." "There's room for both in good governance," Tommy replied. "Intelligence without wisdom is just showing off. Wisdom without intelligence can't solve complex problems. But when you combine them," he gestured to the proposal between them, "that's when real progress happens." As the afternoon light continued to fade outside her office windows, Margaret felt something shifting inside her heart. The armor of arrogance she had worn for so long was finally beginning to crack, revealing the idealistic young woman who had entered politics to make a difference, not to make a point. 3 months later, the Hart Senate office building buzzed with unusual energy as senators, staff members, and journalists gathered for what had become one of the most talked-about hearings of the year. The Rural Infrastructure and Community Development Subcommittee meeting had drawn unprecedented attention, not just for its bipartisan proposal, but for the unlikely partnership that had created it. Margaret Whitfield and Tommy Tuberville sat side by side at the witness table, their joint proposals spread before them like a peace treaty between two different worlds. Margaret wore a more relaxed version of her usual professional attire, still polished, but somehow more approachable. Tommy maintained his characteristic calm demeanor, but there was a new energy about him, the satisfaction of someone whose ideas were finally being taken seriously by the broader political establishment. The gallery was packed with representatives from rural communities across America, farmers from Iowa, small business owners from Montana, teachers from Alabama, healthcare workers from Wyoming. Many had driven for hours or flown in on their own dime to witness this rare moment when Washington seemed to be listening to their voices rather than talking past them. Senator Patricia Chen, now serving as subcommittee chair, called the hearing to order. Ladies and gentlemen, we're here today to examine the Rural Communities Revitalization Act, a comprehensive approach to infrastructure development that has garnered bipartisan support and national attention. Senators Whitfield and Tuberville, the floor is yours. Margaret stood first, her prepared remarks in hand, but then she set them aside and spoke from her heart. Chairwoman Chen, members of the committee, 3 months ago, I made a mistake that taught me one of the most valuable lessons of my career. I allowed my arrogance to blind me to the wisdom of a colleague, and by extension, to the needs of the people we both serve. Murmurs rippled through the gallery. Political apologies were rare in Washington, but one this public and this personal was virtually unheard of. I stood in a committee room and dismissed Senator Tuberville as a dumb country man, Margaret continued, her voice steady despite the difficulty of the admission. In doing so, I revealed my own ignorance, not about policy or law, but about the fundamental principle that good governance requires both expertise and humility, both intelligence and wisdom. Now she turned slightly to acknowledge Tommy, who nodded encouragingly. What Senator Tuberville taught me is that the most sophisticated policy proposals mean nothing if they don't address the real challenges faced by real people. Our proposal today represents not just a meeting of minds, but a meeting of methodologies, combining rigorous policy analysis with authentic grassroots understanding. Tommy rose as Margaret took her seat, his presence commanding the room not through intimidation, but through quiet authority. Thank you, Senator Whitfield. Chairwoman Chen, members of the committee, when I first came to the Senate, I knew I had a lot to learn about the legislative process. What I didn't expect was how much I'd learn about the difference between being heard and being listened to. He gestured toward the gallery filled with rural Americans. These folks behind me, they've been talking to Washington for decades. They've filled out surveys, attended town halls, written letters to their representatives. But somehow, their voices kept getting lost in translation between Main Street and the marble corridors of power. A farmer in a well-worn John Deere cap nodded vigorously from the third row, his weathered hands folded over a folder containing his own testimony. Our proposal, Tommy continued, starts with a simple premise. Infrastructure isn't just about roads and bridges, though those are important. It's about connection, connecting rural communities to opportunities, connecting people to services they need, connecting ideas that work in one place to places where they might work even better. He opened the thick binder before him, revealing months of collaborative work. Senator Whitfield brought something crucial to this partnership, the legal framework and policy expertise to turn good intentions into effective legislation. She taught me how to navigate the complex regulatory environment, how to structure funding mechanisms that will survive budget cycles and political changes. Margaret felt a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with praise and everything to do with purpose. For the first time in her political career, she felt like she was part of something larger than her own ambition. But what I brought to the partnership, Tommy continued, was something equally important. direct connection to the communities this legislation is designed to serve. Senator Whitfield and I didn't just write this proposal in Washington offices. We traveled together to rural communities in 15 different states. We sat in farm kitchens, visited small-town hospitals, toured manufacturing facilities, met with teachers and students and business owners. The hearing room was completely silent now. Even the usually restless press corps focused intently on Tommy's words. "And here's what we learned," he said, his voice growing stronger. "The people in rural America aren't asking for handouts or special treatment. They're asking for the same opportunities that urban and suburban Americans take for granted. Reliable internet, so their kids can compete in a digital economy. Healthcare facilities within reasonable driving distance, transportation infrastructure that doesn't add hours to basic errands, educational opportunities that don't require leaving their communities behind." Senator James Rodriguez leaned forward at the committee table. "Senator Tuberville, can you walk us through some specific examples of how this collaboration changed the proposal from its original conception?" Tommy nodded and looked to Margaret, who stood to join him at the microphone. The easy collaboration between them was evident to everyone in the room. "Certainly," Margaret replied. "Initially, I was focused on the macroeconomic implications, job creation, GDP impact, multiplier effects, all important considerations, but as Senator Tuberville helped me understand, they didn't address the daily realities of rural life." She pulled out a map marked with colored pins representing their site visits. "In Montana, we met Sarah Jenkins, a single mother who drives 45 minutes each way to the nearest hospital for her daughter's asthma treatments. The economic impact of improved transportation infrastructure for her isn't measured in GDP points. It's measured in hours of lost wages and anxiety about medical emergencies." Tommy picked up the narrative seamlessly. "In Iowa, we talked to Bill Morrison, whose family has farmed the same land for 4 generations. He's got innovative ideas about sustainable agriculture, but he can't implement them because the internet connection on his farm can't handle the data requirements of modern farming equipment. What we realized," Margaret continued, "was that our original approach was backwards. Instead of starting with what Washington thought rural communities needed, we needed to start with what rural communities told us they needed, then work backwards to the policy mechanisms that could address those needs." The farmer in the John Deere cap wiped tears from his eyes. After decades of feeling invisible to federal policymakers, he was witnessing his daily struggles being discussed with both understanding and respect in the halls of power. Senator Chen consulted her notes. "This collaborative approach is admirable, but let's talk specifics. How does your proposal address the perennial challenge of funding rural infrastructure when the population density makes traditional cost-benefit analysis challenging?" This was the kind of technical question that Margaret would have once used to demonstrate her superior understanding. Instead, she and Tommy exchanged a quick glance, and he answered first. "That's where Senator Whitfield's legal expertise proved invaluable," Tommy said. "She identified several existing federal programs that weren't being utilized effectively because rural communities lacked the resources to navigate the application processes. Rather than creating entirely new funding streams, we've proposed streamlining existing programs and providing technical assistance to help rural communities access resources that are already available." Margaret nodded. "But we also incorporated Senator Tuberville's insight about leveraging local knowledge and resources. Instead of top-down federal mandates, our proposal emphasizes federal-local partnerships, where Washington provides resources and regulatory flexibility, while local communities provide implementation strategies that fit their specific circumstances. a D. The collaboration between them was so natural now that they finished each other's thoughts, their different expertise areas complementing rather than competing with each other. The hearing continued for another 2 hours, with committee members asking detailed questions about everything from environmental impact to implementation timelines. But it was clear to everyone present that something unprecedented was happening. 2 senators from different parties, different backgrounds, and dramatically different communication styles had found a way to work together that elevated both their individual strengths and created something neither could have accomplished alone. As the formal hearing concluded, the gallery erupted in sustained applause. The farmers, teachers, business owners, and healthcare workers who had made the journey to Washington were witnessing something they had rarely seen. Politicians who had listened to them, understood their challenges, and crafted solutions that addressed their real needs rather than their perceived deficiencies. Margaret and Tommy remained at the witness table as people filed out, both of them understanding that they had just participated in something that went far beyond legislative process. They had demonstrated that American democracy could still work when people were willing to set aside ego, embrace humility, and focus on service rather than self-promotion. 6 months after the Rural Communities Revitalization Act passed with overwhelming bipartisan support, Margaret Whitfield stood in her office, packing the last of her personal belongings into cardboard boxes. But these weren't the boxes of defeat that so many senators packed when leaving office. These were the boxes of transformation, filled with mementos from a journey that had fundamentally changed not just her approach to politics, but her understanding of herself. The morning sun streamed through her windows one last time as a senator, casting familiar shadows across the office that had once been her fortress of intellectual isolation, but had become, in these final months, a place of genuine collaboration and purpose. Tomorrow, she would begin her new role as Director of Rural Policy at the Bipartisan Policy Center, a position that would allow her to continue the work she and Tommy had started without the pressures of electoral politics. A gentle knock at her door interrupted her packing. "Come in," she called, though she already knew who it would be. Tommy Tuberville entered carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the same warm smile that had once irritated her, but now felt like a greeting from family. Over the months of their collaboration, their weekly coffee meetings had become legendary among Senate staff. The Harvard lawyer and the Alabama football coach, finding solutions that had eluded Washington's brightest minds for decades. "Thought you might need some fuel for the road," Tommy said, handing her a cup. "It's that special blend from Alabama I told you about. Mrs. Johnson at the general store back home says it's strong enough to wake the dead and smooth enough to convert a Yankee." Margaret laughed, the sound genuine and unreserved. "I'm going to miss these coffee talks, Tommy, more than you know." They stood together looking out the window at the Capitol dome, both understanding that they were witnessing the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The Rural Communities Revitalization Act had become a model for bipartisan cooperation, cited by political scientists and praised by editorial boards across the country. But for Margaret and Tommy, the legislation's success was secondary to the personal transformation it had facilitated. "You know," Tommy said thoughtfully, "when I quoted Lincoln at you that day, I wasn't trying to embarrass you. I was trying to remind both of us that wisdom doesn't always come dressed in the clothes we expect." Margaret nodded, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup. "I've thought about that moment every day since, not with shame anymore, but with gratitude. You gave me a gift that day, Tommy. You gave me back myself." She walked to her desk and picked up a framed photograph from their first joint town hall in rural Alabama. In the picture, Margaret sat on a hay bale next to an elderly farmer, listening intently as he explained the challenges of modern agriculture. Her expensive suit looked out of place in the barn setting, but her expression showed genuine engagement and respect. "This picture," she said, showing it to Tommy, "represents everything I had forgotten about why I went into politics. I wasn't supposed to be the smartest person in the room. I was supposed to be the person who listened to the smartest people in every room I entered." Tommy studied the photograph, remembering that day when Margaret had shed her senatorial armor and simply sat with farmers, learning about their lives without trying to impress them with her credentials. "You know what I see in this picture?" he asked. "I see the woman your father raised, the public defender who fought for people who couldn't fight for themselves. She was always there, Margaret. You just had to remember how to let her out." A knock at the door interrupted their reflection. David, Margaret's chief of staff, poked his head in. "Senator, the car is here for your flight to Hartford. Your farewell speech at the Connecticut Democratic dinner is in 4 hours." Margaret nodded, then turned back to Tommy. "Will you do me a favor? Will you watch the speech tonight? I want to try something I've never done before." "What's that?" Tommy asked. "I want to give a speech without trying to prove how smart I am. I want to give a speech that might actually change someone's mind about what leadership looks like." More that evening, in a ballroom filled with Connecticut Democratic Party donors, activists, and elected officials, Margaret Whitfield stood at a podium for what everyone assumed would be a typical farewell address. A recitation of accomplishments, expressions of gratitude, and promises to continue the fight from outside office. Instead, she delivered something unprecedented. "My friends," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the elegant ballroom, "I want to tell you about the day I learned the difference between being intelligent and being wise. It was the day a man I had just insulted taught me one of the most valuable lessons of my life." The audience, expecting political platitudes, fell silent with curiosity. Margaret had their complete attention. "I called a colleague a dumb countryman," she continued, her honesty cutting through the typical political rhetoric like a sword through silk. "I said it because his accent was different from mine, because his background was different from mine, because I was so insecure about my own place in Washington that I felt the need to diminish others, to elevate myself." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. This wasn't the kind of confession they expected from a departing senator. That colleague responded by quoting Abraham Lincoln, "It is better to remain silent and be thought a fool than to speak and remove all doubt." In that moment, I realized that I had been the fool. Not because I lacked intelligence, but because I had confused intelligence with wisdom, credentials with character, sophistication with understanding. She paused, looking out at the sea of faces that represented the political establishment she was leaving behind. "I want to challenge each of you tonight," Margaret continued, her voice gaining strength, "to examine whether you're listening to learn or listening to respond. Are you seeking to understand different perspectives, or are you seeking to defeat them? Are you building bridges between communities, or are you building walls around your own ideological comfort zones?" In his Senate office in Washington, Tommy Tuberville watched the speech on C-SPAN, a proud smile spreading across his face. Around him, his own staff members had gathered to watch their former colleague's farewell address. "The Rural Communities Revitalization Act," Margaret continued, "wasn't successful because 2 senators had different expertise. It was successful because 2 senators learned to value each other's perspective and combine their strengths in service of something larger than themselves. It was successful because we stopped trying to prove who was right and started focusing on what was right." The ballroom was completely silent now, 500 of Connecticut's most influential Democrats hanging on every word from a woman who had just confessed to embodying everything they claimed to oppose about political elitism. "I learned that wisdom often comes disguised as simplicity," Margaret said, her voice softening with genuine emotion. "That the most profound insights sometimes emerge from conversations in farm kitchens rather than faculty lounges." That a man with a football coaching background might understand human nature and community building better than someone with multiple Ivy League degrees. She looked directly into the camera, knowing that Tommy and countless others were watching across the country. Senator Tommy Tuberville taught me that true leadership isn't about being the smartest person in the room. It's about bringing out the best in everyone around you. It's about listening more than speaking, learning more than teaching, and serving more than being served. The applause that followed wasn't the polite, obligatory clapping that typically greeted political speeches. It was sustained, genuine appreciation for a moment of authentic human connection that transcended party lines and political calculation. As Margaret concluded her remarks and stepped away from the podium, she felt lighter than she had in years. The armor of arrogance that had protected her insecurities for so long was finally gone, replaced by something far more powerful. The confidence that comes from knowing who you really are and what you're really fighting for. 3 months later, Margaret sat in a small diner in rural Montana, sharing coffee and conversation with Sarah Jenkins, the single mother they had met during their infrastructure tour. Sarah's daughter Emma, now breathing easier thanks to a new rural health clinic funded through their legislation, colored quietly in a coloring book while the adults talked. "You know what's funny?" Sarah said, stirring sugar into her coffee. "When you and Senator Tuberville first came here, I was skeptical. I thought it was just another dog and pony show, politicians pretending to care about rural issues for a few hours before heading back to Washington and forgetting all about us." Margaret smiled, remembering her own skepticism about Tommy's approach to governance. "What changed your mind?" "You listened," Sarah replied simply. "Not the kind of listening where you're just waiting for your turn to talk, but real listening. You asked questions that showed you understood that our problems aren't just statistics in some government report. They're about real families trying to build real lives in places we love." Emma looked up from her coloring book, studying Margaret with the direct gaze that only children possess. "Are you the lady who helped get the doctor closer to our house?" she asked. "I helped a little," Margaret replied, crouching down to Emma's eye level. "But the real heroes were people like your mum who told us what you needed, and people like Senator Tuberville who knew how to listen." As Margaret drove away from the diner that afternoon, her rental car winding through the Montana countryside toward the small airport where her flight back to Washington waited, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. A year ago, she would have measured the success of her Montana trip in terms of media coverage, political capital, and strategic advantage. Now, she measured it in Emma's easier breathing and Sarah's renewed faith in democratic governance. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Tommy. "Saw the news story about your Montana visit. Proud of you, partner. The work continues." Margaret smiled and voice texted back, "Learning every day. Coffee next week when I'm back in DC." "Wouldn't miss it," came his immediate reply. "Mrs. Johnson sent another bag of that Alabama blend. Says you're almost converted." As her plane lifted off from the small Montana airport, Margaret watched the vast landscape unfold below her. Endless fields, scattered farmhouses, winding rivers that connected communities across impossible distances. It was a view that once would have seemed empty to her urban sensibilities, but now she saw it as Tommy had taught her to see it. Not as emptiness, but as space filled with possibility, populated by people whose wisdom often exceeded their formal education, whose insights could transform national policy if only someone took the time to listen. Back in Washington, Tommy Tuberville was preparing for another day of committee hearings, but his approach to governance had been transformed by his partnership with Margaret just as profoundly as hers had been. He had learned to combine his intuitive understanding of human nature with more sophisticated policy frameworks, to translate grassroots wisdom into legislative language that could survive the complex machinery of federal government. The Rural Communities Revitalization Act had become a template for bipartisan cooperation, studied by political scientists and replicated by other senators seeking to bridge ideological divides. But for Tommy, its greatest success wasn't legislative. It was personal. He had helped a brilliant woman remember her own compassion, and in doing so had reminded himself that even the most entrenched political divisions could be overcome when people approached each other with humility and genuine respect. Epilogue: Ripples of Change. 2 years after Margaret Whitfield's departure from the Senate, the story of her transformation alongside Tommy Tuberville had become more than just Washington legend. It had become a case study taught in political science programs across the country, a template for authentic leadership that inspired a new generation of public servants. Dr. Angela Rodriguez, a young political science professor at Georgetown University, stood before a classroom of graduate students, many of whom harbored their own ambitions for public service. On the whiteboard behind her, she had written 2 quotes. "It is better to remain silent and be thought a fool than to speak and remove all doubt." Abraham Lincoln. And below it, "True leadership isn't about being the smartest person in the room. It's about bringing out the best in everyone around you." Margaret Whitfield. Today we're examining what scholars are calling the Whitfield-Tuberville model of bipartisan governance. Dr. Rodriguez began, her voice carrying the enthusiasm of someone who had found real hope in an increasingly cynical political environment. "Can anyone tell me what made their partnership so effective when countless other attempts at bipartisan cooperation have failed?" An earnest young man named Michael raised his hand. He wore a perfectly pressed suit and carried himself with the confidence of someone destined for political greatness. "Professor Rodriguez, I think their success came from combining different expertise areas. Legal knowledge with grassroots understanding. It was a smart, strategic alliance." Dr. Rodriguez nodded but pressed further. "That's part of it, Michael. But plenty of politicians have tried to combine different skill sets. What made this partnership unique?" Sarah Chen, a first-generation college student whose parents had immigrated from Taiwan, raised her hand tentatively. "Maybe it was because Senator Whitfield admitted she was wrong. I mean, publicly apologizing for calling someone a dumb countryman. That's not something politicians usually do." "Excellent observation, Sarah," Dr. Rodriguez replied. "But let's dig deeper. What do you think that apology represented beyond just political strategy?" The classroom fell silent as students grappled with the question. Finally, an older student named James, who had served in the military before returning to school, spoke up. "I think it represented genuine humility. In the military, we learned that the best leaders aren't the ones who never make mistakes. They're the ones who acknowledge their mistakes and learn from them." Senator Whitfield didn't just apologize for strategic reasons. She genuinely recognized that her arrogance had blinded her to valuable perspectives. Dr. Rodriguez smiled. "Exactly, James. And that brings us to the heart of what made their partnership work. It wasn't just about combining different skills, it was about combining different approaches to learning and leadership." She turned to write on the whiteboard. "Intellectual humility plus authentic connection. Effective governance." Senator Tuberville didn't just bring folksy wisdom to the partnership, she continued. He brought a fundamental understanding that effective leadership requires listening to and learning from the people you serve. Senator Whitfield didn't just bring policy expertise. She brought the intellectual rigor necessary to translate grassroots insights into workable legislation. Michael, still confident in his political ambitions, raised his hand again. "But Professor, Isn't this just a feel-good story? I mean, how do we measure the actual impact of their approach? Did it really change anything beyond one piece of legislation? Dr. Rodriguez pulled up a presentation slide showing data from the past 2 years. Great question, Michael. Let's look at the measurable impacts. The Rural Communities Revitalization Act has resulted in a 23% increase in rural internet access, a 31% improvement in rural healthcare accessibility, and the creation of over 45,000 jobs in rural communities. But perhaps more importantly, it's inspired 17 similar bipartisan partnerships in Congress, addressing everything from veterans affairs to environmental protection. She clicked to the next slide, showing polling data. Public approval of Congress has increased for the first time in over a decade, with 67% of Americans citing the Whitfield-Tuberville partnership as an example of how politics should work. But the real impact goes beyond polling numbers. Sarah raised her hand again. What do you mean by real impact, Professor? I mean the cultural impact, Dr. Rodriguez replied. The story of their partnership has changed how people think about political leadership. It's demonstrated that intellectual humility and authentic connection aren't signs of weakness. They're sources of strength. It's shown that admitting you don't have all the answers isn't disqualifying for leadership. It's essential for effective leadership. She paused, looking around the classroom at faces that represented the future of American governance. Some, like Michael, still carried the armor of ambition and certainty that had once defined Margaret Whitfield. Others, like Sarah and James, seemed to grasp intuitively the deeper lessons of the partnership. Here's what I want you to consider as you think about your own potential careers in public service, Dr. Rodriguez continued. Margaret Whitfield and Tommy Tuberville didn't succeed despite their differences. They succeeded because of their differences, but only after they learned to value those differences rather than being threatened by them. She clicked to a final slide showing a photograph from Margaret's current work at the Bipartisan Policy Center. Margaret sitting around a table with farmers, urban planners, environmental scientists, and business leaders, all engaged in animated discussion about sustainable agriculture policy. This photograph was taken last month, Dr. Rodriguez said. Margaret Whitfield is now leading efforts to develop climate-resilient farming practices that can work for both large commercial operations and small family farms. Notice anything about her body language. The students studied the image. Margaret was leaning forward, clearly listening intently to a farmer in overalls who was gesturing animatedly. Her expensive suit was gone, replaced by simple professional attire. Most notably, she wasn't positioned at the head of the table. She was integrated into the circle, just another participant in the conversation. She's not trying to be the smartest person in the room, Sarah observed quietly. Exactly, Dr. Rodriguez replied. She's being the person who helps everyone in the room be their smartest selves. That's the essence of the Whitfield-Tuberville model. Leadership through service, intelligence through humility, progress through partnership. Meanwhile, in Senator Tommy Tuberville's office, a similar conversation was taking place. Tommy sat across from a young staffer named Marcus Williams, a recent college graduate who had grown up in rural Mississippi and carried both the pride and the insecurities that came from straddling two different worlds. "Senator," Marcus said, his voice betraying his nervousness, "I've been thinking about the Agriculture Committee hearing next week. I have some ideas, but I'm not sure they're sophisticated enough for this level of government." Tommy leaned back in his chair, studying the young man with the same thoughtful attention he had once given to football players struggling with confidence issues. "Marcus, tell me about these ideas. Don't worry about whether they sound sophisticated. Worry about whether they might help real people solve real problems." Marcus took a deep breath. "Well, sir, I've been thinking about the crop insurance program. The way it's structured now, It's really complicated for small farmers to navigate. Back home, my uncle nearly lost his farm because he couldn't figure out how to file the right paperwork after a flood. But what if we simplified the process? What if instead of requiring farmers to prove their losses meet specific federal criteria, we trusted local agricultural extension agents to verify damages and expedite payments? Tommy nodded thoughtfully. That's an interesting approach, Marcus. What made you think of it? Honestly, sir, it comes from watching how things work in small communities. People know each other. They know who's honest and who isn't. They understand local conditions better than bureaucrats in Washington. My uncle's neighbors knew he'd suffered real losses, but that knowledge didn't count for anything in the federal system. So you're suggesting we leverage local knowledge and relationships to make federal programs more effective and accessible, Tommy said. That doesn't sound unsophisticated to me, Marcus. That sounds like wisdom. Marcus looked surprised. Really, sir? I was worried it was too simple. Tommy smiled, remembering his own journey from feeling dismissed as a dumb countryman to recognizing that simplicity and wisdom often went hand in hand. Marcus, let me tell you something I learned from working with Senator Whitfield. The best solutions are often the simplest ones, not because they're easy, but because they're based on understanding how things really work, rather than how we think they should work. He pulled out a legal pad and began sketching out Marcus's idea. Your proposal addresses 3 fundamental problems with current crop insurance: accessibility, efficiency, and accountability. Those are exactly the kinds of insights that Senator Whitfield taught me to value and that she learned to translate into effective policy. Marcus watched as Tommy outlined potential legislative language that could capture his grassroots insight. Senator, can I ask you something? How do you know when an idea is worth pursuing versus when it's just not ready for this level? Tommy set down his pen and looked directly at Marcus. That's a great question, and it gets to the heart of something important. The measure of an idea isn't how complicated it sounds or how many academic theories it references. The measure of an idea is whether it has the potential to improve real people's lives while being practically implementable within our system of government. He gestured toward the legal pad where Marcus's idea was taking shape. Your crop insurance proposal meets both criteria. It's grounded in real-world understanding of how rural communities function, and it can be implemented through existing administrative structures with relatively minor legislative changes. Marcus nodded, beginning to understand. So it's not about dumbing things down or making them more complicated. It's about finding the right level of complexity to solve the actual problem. Exactly, Tommy replied. Senator Whitfield used to say that intelligence without wisdom is just showing off, but wisdom without intelligence can't navigate complex systems. The magic happens when you combine grassroots wisdom with institutional intelligence. As their conversation continued, Tommy found himself reflecting on how much his own approach to mentorship had evolved. 2 years ago, he might have simply encouraged Marcus to trust his instincts without helping him understand how to translate those instincts into effective policy. Now, thanks to his partnership with Margaret, he understood the importance of building bridges between different types of knowledge and different ways of understanding problems. That evening, Margaret called Tommy from her hotel room in Des Moines, where she had spent the day meeting with corn farmers about sustainable agriculture practices. Their weekly check-ins had become a cornerstone of both their professional and personal growth. "How was Iowa?" Tommy asked, settling into his favorite chair with a cup of Mrs. Johnson's coffee blend. "Humbling, as always," Margaret replied with a laugh. "I spent the morning with a farmer named Bill Peterson, who's been experimenting with cover crops to prevent soil erosion." This man has a high school education and has developed techniques that are more sophisticated than anything I studied in environmental law. He's essentially conducting long-term field experiments that could revolutionize sustainable agriculture. But he doesn't have the academic language to describe what he's doing. Tommy nodded. Sounds familiar. Did you help him translate his knowledge into policy language? That's exactly what we spent the afternoon doing, Margaret said. By the end of our conversation, we had outlined a pilot program that could test his techniques on a broader scale while providing scientific documentation of their effectiveness. It's the kind of partnership between practical knowledge and academic research that neither of us could have created alone. She paused, and Tommy could hear the satisfaction in her voice. You know what the most rewarding part was? Bill said it was the first time a government official had asked him to teach them something instead of trying to teach him something. He felt like his decades of experience were finally being valued. Tommy smiled. That's the gift you learn to give people, Margaret. The gift of being heard and valued. It's something I think you always had in you, but you had to learn to trust it. And you taught me that trusting people's wisdom doesn't mean abandoning intellectual rigor, Margaret replied. It means applying that rigor in service of understanding and amplifying existing wisdom rather than replacing it with academic theories. As their conversation continued, both of them understood that they were part of something larger than their individual careers or even their specific policy achievements. They had demonstrated that American democracy could still function as its founders intended, not as a system where the smartest or most powerful people imposed their will on others, but as a system where diverse perspectives could be woven together into solutions that served the common good. The story of Margaret Whitfield and Tommy Tuberville had become more than a political partnership. It had become a reminder of democracy's fundamental promise. In a nation founded on the principle that ordinary citizens could govern themselves, they had shown that extraordinary results could emerge when people approached each other with humility, curiosity, and genuine respect for different forms of knowledge and experience. Their legacy lived on not just in the legislation they had crafted together, but in the countless students, staffers, and fellow politicians who had learned from their example that true leadership required not just intelligence or charisma, but the wisdom to recognize that the best solutions often emerged from listening to the voices that were too often dismissed or ignored. Years later, when political historians would look back at this period in American governance, they would mark the Whitfield-Tuberville partnership as a turning point, not because it solved all of democracy's challenges, but because it reminded people that those challenges could be overcome when leaders chose humility over arrogance, collaboration over competition, and service over self-promotion. The inscription above the entrance to the Capitol building reads, "E pluribus unum," out of many, one. Margaret Whitfield and Tommy Tuberville had learned that this ideal wasn't just about geography or demographics, but about the possibility that diverse perspectives, when approached with mutual respect and genuine humility, could create solutions that neither could have imagined alone. Their story continued to inspire new generations of leaders who understood that democracy's greatest strength wasn't its institutions or its processes, but its capacity to transform people who were willing to be transformed, to humble those who were willing to be humbled, and to unite those who were willing to put country above self in service of the common good that binds all Americans together. The end, her voice softening with genuine emotion. That the most profound insights sometimes emerge from conversations in farm kitchens rather than faculty lounges. That a man with a football coaching background might understand human nature and community building better than someone with multiple Ivy League degrees. She looked directly into the camera, knowing that Tommy and countless others were watching across the country. Senator Tommy Tuberville taught me that true leadership isn't about being the smartest person in the room. It's about bringing out the best in everyone around you. It's about listening more than speaking, learning more than teaching, and serving more than being served. The applause that followed wasn't the polite, obligatory clapping that typically greeted political speeches. It was sustained, genuine appreciation for a moment of authentic human connection that transcended party lines and political calculation. As Margaret concluded her remarks and stepped away from the podium, she felt lighter than she had in years. The armor of arrogance that had protected her insecurities for so long was finally gone, replaced by something far more powerful. The confidence that comes from knowing who you really are and what you're really fighting for. 3 months later, Margaret sat in a small diner in rural Montana, sharing coffee and conversation with Sarah Jenkins, the single mother they had met during their infrastructure tour. Sarah's daughter Emma, now breathing easier thanks to a new rural health clinic funded through their legislation, colored quietly in a coloring book while the adults talked. "You know what's funny?" Sarah said, stirring sugar into her coffee. "When you and Senator Tuberville first came here, I was skeptical. I thought it was just another dog and pony show, politicians pretending to care about rural issues for a few hours before heading back to Washington and forgetting all about us." Margaret smiled, remembering her own skepticism about Tommy's approach to governance. "What changed your mind?" "You listened," Sarah replied simply. "Not the kind of listening where you're just waiting for your turn to talk, but real listening. You asked questions that showed you understood that our problems aren't just statistics in some government report. They're about real families trying to build real lives in places we love." Emma looked up from her coloring book, studying Margaret with the direct gaze that only children possess. "Are you the lady who helped get the doctor closer to our house?" she asked. "I helped a little," Margaret replied, crouching down to Emma's eye level. "But the real heroes were people like your mom, who told us what you needed, and people like Senator Tuberville, who knew how to listen." As Margaret drove away from the diner that afternoon, her rental car winding through the Montana countryside toward the small airport where her flight back to Washington waited, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. A year ago, she would have measured the success of her Montana trip in terms of media coverage, political capital, and strategic advantage. Now, she measured it in Emma's easier breathing and Sarah's renewed faith in democratic governance. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Tommy. "Saw the news story about your Montana visit. Proud of you, partner. The work continues." Margaret smiled and voice texted back, "Learning every day. Coffee next week when I'm back in DC? Wouldn't miss it," came his immediate reply. "Mrs. Johnson sent another bag of that Alabama blend. Says you're almost converted." As her plane lifted off from the small Montana airport, Margaret watched the vast landscape unfold below her. Endless fields, scattered farmhouses, winding rivers that connected communities across impossible distances. It was a view that once would have seemed empty to her urban sensibilities, but now she saw it as Tommy had taught her to see it. Not as emptiness, but as space filled with possibility, populated by people whose wisdom often exceeded their formal education, whose insights could transform national policy if only someone took the time to listen. Back in Washington, Tommy Tuberville was preparing for another day of committee hearings, but his approach to governance had been transformed by his partnership with Margaret just as profoundly as hers had been. He had learned to combine his intuitive understanding of human nature with more sophisticated policy frameworks, to translate grassroots wisdom into legislative language that could survive the complex machinery of federal government. The Rural Communities Revitalization Act had become a template for bipartisan cooperation, studied by political scientists and replicated by other senators seeking to bridge ideological divides. But for Tommy, its greatest success wasn't legislative. It was personal. He had helped a brilliant woman remember her own compassion, and in doing so had reminded himself that even the most entrenched political divisions could be overcome when people approached each other with humility and genuine respect. The story of Margaret Whitfield and Tommy Tuberville became a legend in Washington, told and retold in coffee shops and committee rooms, in graduate school seminars and Sunday morning talk shows. It was a story that reminded people why they had been drawn to public service in the first place, before cynicism and ambition had clouded their original idealistic motivations. But perhaps the most important audience for their story was the countless Americans who watched from a distance as two senators demonstrated that democracy could still work when leaders chose wisdom over cleverness, collaboration over competition, and service over self-promotion. In an era when political discourse had devolved into tribal warfare, Margaret and Tommy had shown that it was still possible for people from different backgrounds, different parties, and different worldviews to find common ground in their shared commitment to making life better for the people they served. Years later, when Margaret would speak to young people considering careers in public service, she would always return to that moment in the Senate committee room when Tommy Tuberville had quoted Abraham Lincoln. She would tell them that the most important qualification for leadership wasn't the university they attended or the credentials they accumulated, but their willingness to listen, to learn, and to be changed by their encounters with wisdom wherever they might find it. And when Tommy would speak to new senators during their orientation programs, he would share the story of how a brilliant lawyer from Connecticut had taught him that intelligence and wisdom, when combined with humility, could move mountains, or at least move legislation through the Byzantine processes of American government. Their partnership had ended Margaret's Senate career, but had begun something far more important, a demonstration that American democracy's greatest strength wasn't its institutions or its processes, but its capacity to transform people who were willing to be transformed, to humble those who were willing to be humbled, and to unite those who were willing to put country above self. The inscription above the entrance to the Capitol building reads, "E pluribus unum," out of many one. Margaret Whitfield and Tommy Tuberville had learned that this ideal wasn't just about geography or demographics, but about the possibility that diverse perspectives, when approached with mutual respect and genuine humility, could create solutions that neither could have imagined alone. In the end, their story wasn't really about rural infrastructure or political cooperation. It was about the timeless truth that Abraham Lincoln had recognized more than a century earlier, that wisdom often comes disguised as simplicity, that strength often emerges from admitting weakness, and that the greatest leaders are those who understand that their job is not to be the smartest person in the room, but to help everyone in the room become their best selves. The morning sun continued to rise over the Capitol dome, casting its light on a building filled with flawed human beings trying to govern a complex nation. But somewhere in those marble halls, the echo of Tommy Tuberville's gentle wisdom and Margaret Whitfield's transformed humility continued to inspire others to choose collaboration over competition, understanding over judgment, and service over self-promotion. It was a legacy built not on grand gestures or historic speeches, but on the simple recognition that democracy works best when its practitioners remember that they are servants, not masters, and that wisdom, like sunlight, can come from the most unexpected sources, illuminating paths forward that seemed impossible in the darkness of division and mistrust. The end